You were always the disappointment, my father told me as the family nodded. I smiled and left. A month later, he showed up at my door, looking exhausted. We need to talk, he said, his voice shaking. Okay, so I, 31F, need some perspective here because I'm not sure if I overreacted, but I feel like I was justified in my actions. Here's the backstory. I come from a family where everything is about appearances and tradition. My dad, let's call him Frank, 60, has always been this larger-than-life figure in our family. He's the kind of person who expects perfection, and for the longest time, I tried to live up to his standards. Growing up, I always felt like I was the one who could never do anything right. My younger brother, 28, and sister, 25, were the golden children. My brother was the athletic one, the one who was good at sports and always received the accolades. My sister, the youngest, was the smart one, the one who excelled in school and always seemed to be at the top of every class. Meanwhile, I was the creative one, artsy, a bit of a daydreamer. I had dreams that didn't fit the mold of what my dad wanted for his children, and he made sure I knew that. I remember when I told him I wanted to go to art school instead of following in his footsteps of business and finance. He told me it was a waste of time, that I'd never make it, that it wasn't practical. He told me I was too stubborn to understand what the world really valued, that I tried for years to win his approval, doing everything I could to fit in. I put aside my own dreams and ambitions to make him proud. I got a degree in something more acceptable, something that wouldn't embarrass him. But no matter how hard I tried, it never seemed to be enough. The praise he gave to my siblings was constant, and I would be lucky if I got a passing remark about how I was doing okay in life. For years, I convinced myself I was fine with that I didn't need his approval. But the older I got, the more I realized I was carrying around a lot of unresolved hurt. The breaking point came at a family dinner. My parents were celebrating their 35th wedding anniversary, and as expected, it was a big, formal affair. The entire family was there: my mom, 58, dad, my brother, my sister, their spouses, and even some extended family. At first, it was the usual polite conversation, the back and forth about how well everyone was doing. My brother was bragging about his recent promotion at work, my sister was talking about her new house, and everyone was just kind of patting each other on the back. Meanwhile, I was trying to fit into this picture-perfect family dynamic that didn't feel like mine. But things took a turn when my dad started talking about what he was most proud of. He went on and on about how proud he was of my brother's achievements, how he was such a natural leader, how his dedication to his career was inspiring. Then, he did the same for my sister, how she was always so driven, so intelligent, and how she'd made the right choices in life. And then came me. My dad turned to me with this half-hearted smile, and in front of everyone, he said, "You were always the disappointment." I'm not even sure what happened in that moment. I froze. My heart dropped into my stomach, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My sister, who had been smiling just a moment ago, looked away awkwardly. My brother just kept his head down and pretended like he hadn't heard it. My mom, as usual, stayed silent. She didn't speak up in my defense. No one did. It was just me, standing there, while my dad's words hung in the air, cutting into me that I didn't know how to respond. I had been in this situation before, where my dad would make a snide comment or dismiss me, but this was different. He had just said something in front of the whole family that I had spent years internalizing. I looked around at everyone, and none of them seemed to think there was anything wrong with what he had said. I could feel the anger rising in me. But more than anything, I felt an overwhelming sense of humiliation. I didn't want to be there anymore, surrounded by people who couldn't see how wrong this was, who didn't understand how much it hurt. I stood up, told my dad, "If I'm such a disappointment, maybe you shouldn't expect anything from me anymore." And I walked out. That IT was dramatic, I know, but I couldn't stay there. I had had enough of trying to prove myself to people who would never be satisfied. I left the house without even saying goodbye to my mom or siblings. I just needed to get away, to breathe, to escape the suffocating weight of my family's expectations. That I went home, sat on the couch, and tried to process what had just happened. I couldn't stop thinking about my dad's words. I didn't talk to anyone that night, not even my husband, 32. He knew something was wrong when he saw my face, but I just told him I needed space to think. I didn't want to burden him with this, even though he was always supportive. He had grown up in a family where love was unconditional, where everyone was valued no matter their achievements. He didn't understand the dynamic of my family, but he knew enough to tell me that I didn't have to tolerate the way they treated me. That I thought that walking away would be the end of it. But a month later, my dad showed up at my door. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just finished running some errands. I wasn't expecting him, so I was taken aback when I opened the door and saw him standing there. He looked different. His usual confident, larger-than-life demeanor was gone. He looked tired, almost fragile, like he had aged 10 years in a month. He didn't even wait for me to say anything before he spoke. His voice was shaky, and he said, "We need to talk." I didn't know what to do. I didn't expect him to come to me, especially after everything that had happened. That I stood there for a moment, unsure if I was ready to face him. But eventually, I let him inside. I didn't want to be cold about it, but I also didn't want to jump into any emotional conversation without thinking it through. He sat down on the couch and just stared at the floor, like he didn't know where to begin. He started apologizing. It was hard to hear, because it felt so foreign. My dad had never apologized to me like that before. He said he didn't realize how much his words had hurt me, that he'd been disappointed in his own life, and took it out on me. He said he had always expected more from me, but now he understood that he had pushed me away in the process. That I wanted to believe him. I wanted to hear that this was the start of something different, that he truly regretted the way he treated me. But I couldn't just forgive him that easily. It wasn't just one comment. It was years of belittling, of me trying and failing to meet his impossible standards. He had made me feel like I was never enough, like nothing I did could measure up to my siblings. That I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to just tell him how much he had hurt me, how much his words had affected my entire life. But I also didn't want to close the door on him completely. I didn't want to give up on having a relationship with him, even if it had been so strained for so long. That he sat there, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before he finally spoke again. "I know I can't change the past," he said, "but I want to make things right. I want to fix this if you'll let me." I didn't know what to say. This was the moment I had been waiting for, but now that it was here, I wasn't sure what I wanted. I wasn't sure what making things right even looked like after everything that had happened. Would I be able to forgive him? Should I? I needed time to think, and I told him that. I told him I wasn't ready to make any decisions, but that I appreciated his apology. After he left, I sat with my thoughts for a long time. My heart was torn between wanting to rebuild the relationship with my dad and not knowing if it was worth it. But I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over yet. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I found myself replaying the conversation with my dad over and over in my head. On one hand, I was glad he had come to me, apologizing in a way I'd never expected. But on the other hand, it felt like too little, too late. His apology seemed genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was so much more beneath the surface, years of unresolved issues that couldn't be fixed with just a few words. I talked to my husband about it, and he reminded me that I wasn't obligated to accept anything just because he apologized. He said I had every right to take my time and decide what I needed. My husband, despite being a more private person, had always been a good sounding board. He had grown up in a family where boundaries were respected and everyone was allowed to have their own voice. My dad's behavior was something he just couldn't understand, and he wasn't about to tell me what to do. But he also made it clear that I shouldn't feel guilty for setting boundaries with my family. Still, the guilt crept in. I didn't want to be the person who held on to the past, who let hurt define the relationship. But at the same time, I wasn't sure if I could just erase the years of emotional neglect and criticism. Could I forgive him? Should I? I decided to reach out to my sister to see how she felt about all of this. I hadn't spoken to her much since the dinner. She'd messaged me a few times, but it felt like we were walking on eggshells. When I called her, I wasn't sure what to expect. My sister had always been closer to my dad than I was, but I thought maybe, just maybe, she could offer some insight into how I should move forward. When she picked up, she sounded relieved to hear from me. After the usual pleasantries, I asked her how she felt about everything that had happened. I wasn't expecting her to give me a straightforward answer, but I was hoping for something that would help me make sense of all the confusion I was feeling. She paused for a moment, clearly thinking about her words, before she finally spoke. "I get why you're upset," she said softly. "But, it's Dad. He's always been like that. I know it's hurtful, and sometimes I wish he would just stop, but I've learned to deal with it." There was a slight bitterness in her voice, though she tried to mask it. "I guess I just don't see what's new about this. He's always been tough on you. Maybe it's time you let it go and move forward." I wasn't sure if I agreed with her. Letting go felt like an impossibility. How could I just forget what had happened, especially when it had affected my entire sense of self for so long? I tried to explain that I wasn't asking for perfection from him, just some understanding. But she didn't seem to see things from my perspective. "I don't know, Gabby," she continued, using the nickname my family always called me. "I don't think Dad meant it the way you're taking it. You're not a disappointment to him. He just doesn't know how to show he cares. Maybe that's just the way he is." Her words stung, but I understood where she was coming from. My sister had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to smooth things over and keep the family from falling apart. I could hear the exhaustion in her voice, the same tired resignation that I felt deep down. But something about her perspective didn't sit well with me. Was I really supposed to accept that this was just how he was and let it go? After all these years of him making me feel less than, could I really just move on? I didn't have a clear answer. The conversation ended without much resolution, just a promise to talk soon, and that she hoped things would get better between Dad and me. But it was hard to ignore the feeling that we were all just going through the motions of pretending things were fine when they clearly weren't. Later that evening, I found myself looking through old family photos, something I hadn't done in years. I came across a picture of me, my brother, and my sister all grinning at a family barbecue. I was probably about 10 years old at the time, and my dad had one arm around me, smiling proudly. It was a rare moment, a time when I felt like he actually cared about me in a way that was more than just about meeting his expectations. But as I stared at the photo, it also reminded me of all the times he hadn't been there, all the times I had tried so hard to get his approval and never felt like I was enough. I couldn't deny that there were still parts of me that wanted that approval, that craved a father-daughter relationship that was healthy and fulfilling. But at the same time, I was tired. Tired of trying to please someone who never seemed to care how much I struggled. I called my mom the next day, unsure of what I hoped to get out of it. I needed some clarity, some understanding of why things had always been this way. I didn't expect her to have all the answers, but I thought maybe she could offer a different perspective, something that could make sense of everything. When I explained to her what had happened at the dinner and the conversation I'd had with Dad, she was quiet for a while. Finally, she sighed and said, "I'm sorry, honey. I don't know why he does that to you. I know it's not fair. But you know your father. He's complicated." Her words didn't offer much comfort, but they didn't surprise me either. My mom had always been passive in situations like this. She never really stood up to my dad, and I don't think she fully understood how his behavior affected us. She had always just tried to keep the peace in her own way, even if that meant staying silent when things were wrong. "I think you're right to feel hurt," she added after a long pause. "But I also think your dad doesn't know how to change. He's been this way for so long, and I don't know if he can even see how much it's hurt you. But that doesn't mean it's your job to fix him." Her words were simple, but they hit me harder than I expected. I realized that, for years, I had been trying to fix something that might never change. I had been waiting for him to suddenly become the father I needed him to be, but the truth was that he might never be that person. And maybe I needed to accept that, not for his sake, but for my own. It wasn't an easy realization, and it didn't make the decision to forgive him any clearer. But I knew I couldn't keep holding on to the hope that things would magically get better. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own well-being just to maintain some semblance of a relationship with him. I spent the next few days thinking about what my boundaries needed to be, about what kind of relationship I wanted to have with my dad moving forward. I wasn't ready to cut him off completely, but I knew I needed to be clear about what I was willing to tolerate. I didn't want to keep playing the role of the dutiful daughter who would do anything to get his approval, only to be met with disappointment time and time again. Eventually, I decided to call my dad. It wasn't easy. I felt conflicted and unsure, but I knew it was time to talk. He answered after a few rings, and I could hear the hesitation in his voice. "Hey," he said quietly, as if he was waiting for me to say something first. "I've been thinking about our conversation," I started. "And I don't want to pretend like everything's fine when it's not. I'm not going to pretend that I'm okay with how you've treated me all these years, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't feel hurt. But I also don't want to shut you out completely. I just need to be honest with you about how I feel." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I knew this conversation needed to happen. Finally, he spoke. "I know I've messed up, Gabby, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. I'm not asking you to forget, but I am asking for a chance to show you that I can do better." I didn't know if I could believe him, but I appreciated the sincerity in his voice. For the first time in a long time, it felt like he was seeing me, not as the disappointment, but as his daughter. "I'm not sure what that looks like yet," I said, "but I'm willing to figure it out. We'll see where we go from here." It wasn't the perfect resolution, and I didn't expect it to be, but it felt like a step in the right direction. A small, tentative step toward healing. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally taking control of my own story. So, am I the a-hole for walking away from the dinner and taking time to process the apology? Or should I have just let it go and moved on like my sister suggested? What would you do in my situation? Would love some honest opinions. If you've been in a similar situation or have any thoughts on how you would have handled this, I'd love to hear your opinion in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.